Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. Happy post-Thanksgiving. It's nice to see that so many of you have decided that one of the best ways to say thank you is to come to services. And that means we get a chance to be together, a chance to express our gratitude to each other for being here as our community, and of course to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to the Holy One, blessed be He. But giving thanks can sometimes be tricky, because sometimes we feel like we deserve more than we've gotten. Sometimes we'll go to great lengths to get a little more than we've already been given, even when what we've been given has been quite good. Take, for example, Yaakov, young Jacob, one of the most interesting characters throughout all of Bereshit, the book of Genesis. Jacob is, of course, famous later for becoming our father Israel, the founder of the tribes, the progenitor of our entire nation. But prior to that, he had some difficulties in his home life. And we have to examine his deeds and ask the question, is he a thief? Did he steal his brother's birthright? Did he steal his brother's blessing? And the answer is debated, but most of our tradition, of course, comes down on, well, no, he didn't steal the birthright, and he did kind of steal the blessing. Let me explain how our tradition sees it. The birthright, of course, very famously, was sold for a pot of stew. Esau, ever impetuous, comes in from a failed hunt, hungry and famished. His brother is cooking in the tent, where he seems to spend more of his time, and his brother offers that he will give anything for some of what Jacob has been cooking. And Jacob says, fine, I'll give you some of the soup if you give me your birthright. Now, birthright has a very technical meaning in ancient world, not just in Judaism, but all of the ancient Near East, found on numerous inscriptions throughout the region. The birthright was the extra portion of inheritance that the eldest son would receive upon the death of the father. Well, what was being done here was a simple transaction. It was a foolish transaction for Esau. It was a short-sighted transaction for Esau, but then that seems to have been his nature. He sold the promise of an extra portion for his inheritance for the immediate gratification of a bowl of stew. And even though I make a pretty good stew, that does not seem like a great bargain. But if you can't wait for the return on that investment, if you can't wait to be gratified with something in the future and need something now, well, he made a deal, and it was a fair deal in the sense that it was agreed upon fairly and followed the normal terms of such agreements. So, did Jacob steal the birthright? No. The blessing, on the other hand, dressing up in your brother's clothes, putting on fake fur in order to mimic his body texture, trying to prepare a fake dish and lying to your father about who you are because he wants that type of food, and he is trying to give his son Esau the blessing, but is too blind to be able to tell the difference, literally too blind to tell the difference. Well, that seems a little bit more sketchy. After all, this is not an open and clear deal like the selling of stew for a potential share of inheritance. This is a literal act of fraud. But how can you defraud someone from a blessing? I mean, a bowl of stew and an inheritance, those are tangible things that can be easily understood. I can pass you the stew, you pass me that right, we're good. But a blessing? Are blessings concrete objects that can be traded like currency or like commodities in the market? Are blessings something that have an innate power in and of themselves that once uttered, that it changes the nature of reality, and whomever it is pointing at, boom, they become the target, even if there is fraud and deceit? Well, no. Blessings flow through Adonai. They flow from God. So God was not fooled by a disguise. God was not fooled by Jacob's deception. So even if Isaac was tricked, God was not. And since the blessing stuck, God must have approved. God was okay with this. And whatever deception he might have had, it must be okay because after all, God went ahead with it. Well, no, says our tradition, that's not quite the way to read this. Because you see, when we turn to the next chapter, or the next parashah, what happens to Jacob when he comes back to his mother's household? He is lied to. He is cheated. Somebody dresses up in someone else's clothing and pretends to be someone they're not, and he ends up marrying that person. Exactly as he did to his father and brother, so is done to him when he encounters Lavan and goes through all the rigmarole in order to eventually marry Rachel, and through the process acquires Leah. So the Torah may not pontificate in the way that a modern rabbi would, but the Torah still lays it very bare that Jacob is to blame for the deception of his father, for the stealing of the blessing of his brother Esau. But then why did the blessing stick? To understand that, we have to rewind the tape to the beginning of Jacob's life, when he and his brother were inside their mother's womb and already wrestling. And she was beside herself through the suffering of carrying these twins. And she asks, why am I made to suffer like this? And she receives a prophecy from Adonai that there are two nations wrestling in her womb, and the older will be made to serve the younger. Jacob will eventually become the dominant of the two brothers, even though he will be the youngest. Jacob will eventually rise to a position higher than that of his brother, even though he is going to be the youngest, and that is a subversion of the normal pattern within the ancient Near East. So, if it was already planned that Jacob would receive the true blessing that Isaac is about to give, why is Jacob in trouble for having gone through his deception to get what he deserved, what God had promised, what God had prophesied? He is simply enabling God to fulfill the promise. So why is his deception punished by how he is treated in Lavan's house with Rachel and Leah? Because God's promise would have been fulfilled without him engaging in deception as well. See, the promise, the blessing that God had already made to his mother, which she knew about, and was certainly part of her motivation for encouraging Jacob to deceive her husband Isaac, that promise would have come to fruition without the deception of Jacob. Had Jacob simply allowed his father to bless Esau and then receive his own blessing from Isaac, Jacob would have continued in the path that God had laid out. He would have risen to prominence and greatness, all in his own way, in his own time, without the decades of suffering that would come at the hands of Lavan, and then again in the stress and the reunification with his brother at the threat of murder and death. But he jumped the gun. He thought that he had to help God along that path. And while it is true that in order to receive God's blessings, we need human agency, after all, no one puts food on the table simply by praying to God hard enough. You need to get out and do some work for that. We have to make sure that as we pursue the blessings that God has promised, we do not violate the commandments that God has commanded. To violate that command, to deceive his father, one of the 10 commandments itself of honoring your parents, and here he is doing quite the opposite, is showing that he is in fact undermining the potential for what God is wanting to give him. By thinking that I will get the blessing that I deserve by simply cutting these corners, by simply betraying the trust that was given to me to be a man different than my brother, not impetuous, not rapacious, but instead somebody who has patience, who understands that things will take time and we don't always get the gratification instantly, that I would not sell my birthright for soup. Unfortunately, Jacob stumbles at this fence. He stumbles at that point. And he thinks, as his mother encourages him to, that he has to break the rules in order to make things happen the way they are supposed to. And this sets him, in the next few chapters, in motion. And of course, we'll continue to set things in motion all the way up until we are slaves in Egypt, beginning with this act. It is always tempting to think that not only do we know what we deserve, but to think that whatever we want to do to get what we deserve is justified because we deserve it. Jacob and the entirety of the book of Genesis shows us that is not the way it works. The blessings that God makes to Abraham and to Isaac and eventually to Jacob himself all do come to pass. But trying to hurry them along by betraying the commandments that God has given us for what it is to live a good and noble life is undermining and indeed destroying the purpose of those blessings in the first place. God is not showering us with blessings simply because we're so fortunate to deserve them, but because we have been given a path to use those blessings to enrich our lives in moral, ethical, and ways of great meaning and worth. And in doing so, we bless the world around us, as was the initial blessing of Avraham Avinu. So, tempting though it may be, there are no shortcuts. Sometimes we simply have to wait and allow things to take their course, and we will have to trust that the proper blessings will eventually come into alignment. And in the meantime, we do what we can within the commandments to pursue a life of goodness. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.